So the crackdowns got worse as time went on, or they?
Well, they were sort of constant.
They were constant,
So
yeah.
Athol Fugard had to give up his passport for several years. John Connie had to give up his passport. When they were touring in Sizwe Banzi's Dead and the island, they were listed in their passports as Athol Fugard's domestic servants.
Wow.
That was the only, because
Yeah.
actor wasn't a profession that a non-white person could have.
Yeah.
So they were still censored. They were.
Yeah. Well, during that period in the U.S., we had the strong civil rights movement going, and also the anti-war movement. But in both of those cases, at the beginning, in the early '60s, you see the message being sort of written between the lines in the songs,
Exactly.
right? Things like "Blowin' in the Wind," but by the end of the decade, by the end of the '60s, of course, it's just very political and very out and out direct. Is there some kind of a transition like that in South Africa as well?
Yeah. So you see that in Athol Fugard's work.
Well, let's take a community mural for an example. How do you deal with that then if you're approaching it like this? Do you see it as representing somehow the consciousness of the community as well, or?
I think so. I think that's one way. I think you ask people to think about public space and think about representation, how they want to be seen. You think also about place. Where is this mural? What does it mean for people in this particular space and community to have their voice or their image represented, to sort of be in dialogue with the kinds of problems that are there and with imagining the solutions that might be there also.
Yeah. Matthew Brady was being paid by the government to photograph the Civil War. Was Lincoln affiliated with that, I wonder?
They were, Lincoln was a subject for Brady at his studio. In fact, Lincoln famously declared that when he won the 1860 election, he was photographed the same day he gave a famous speech in New York City known as the Cooper Union speech. And that was kind of the big one, right, that established Lincoln's this viable candidate from the West. And that same day, he went with his friends and he sat for a portrait with Brady. And Lincoln's famous statement later was, Brady and Cooper Union made me president. That this photograph circulated in the form of engravings on the cover of magazines. Harper's put it on their cover to commemorate his election several months later. So even as a candidate, Lincoln understood that this medium was really valuable. And then when he became president, he sat often enough that I think kind of tragically, you can look at the impact of the war on his face and on his body in these photographs.
Yeah, I've often noticed that. I think it's it's more striking, I think, than any other example I can think of.
Yeah, and the presidency famously ages everybody, but the Lincoln images, because they were taken over such a comparatively short amount of time, are really shocking in that way.
What are some of the artifacts that you describe in your book? Tell us about them.
Well, the chief materials used by the Inca were stone, metal, and cloth. Cloth made out of the wool from alpacas and llamas and vicuñas. So some of the most, I think, spectacular objects are the tunics that were worn by Inca rulers, and quite a few of those survive in museum collections around the world today.
So they were collected when they were discovered, and so these are the lecture notes of the real Indiana Joneses, right?
The real Indiana Jones teacher, Robert Braidwood, which you can see some of the pots that he's describing, that he wants to describe his students from the early dynastic one period of Mesopotamia, which is, let's say, early 3rd millennium BC, some other artifact classes that he wants to teach them. And then the other figure who we at the OI tend to think must be associated indirectly with Indiana Jones is the OI founder, James Henry Breasted, who is an Egyptologist, in fact, the first American to receive a PhD in Egyptology. And he was adamant that archaeology must not be a sort of navel-gazing academic enterprise, but public-facing. He did a lot of public lectures and wrote public books. And so this book, this notebook of his, for example, shows his recording of Egyptian hieroglyphs that he was doing in the field, which is pretty neat. This notebook's probably about 100 years old or so.
Did people discuss comics like they talk about hot TV shows today? Were they I know this is a period where radio was really king, right?
Right.
Yeah.
In terms of the fan culture,
Yeah.
what we saw, I would say from the 1930s to the 1970s, was a very interactive culture. So my own experience was similar to yours, you know,
Yeah.
where I'd have this group that I knew because we all read comic books, and we trade comic books.
Yeah.
There was this sense of comic books as ephemeral. You didn't necessarily hang on to them and treat them as collectibles like many people do now. So there was this culture that started to form. It became more formalized, too, as we moved into the 1950s, particularly around the genres of crime and then horror. So EC put out a lot of the famous horror comics of the time period. We're most familiar with Tales from the Crypt because it's been adapted in different forms.
Yeah.
And it had these colorful hosts that would introduce the horror tales. They used black humor to sort of liven things up.
Vincent Price types.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And one of the things that happened at that time is Bill Gaines, the publisher of EC, recognized that this was a phenomenon and he could capitalize on it. So that was where we saw the first fan club. Are you an EC addict? That was the tagline, are you an EC addict? And so he started to create this. And when people think about convention culture, they often date it back to that time.
Was there some kind of a tradition in Jamaica where people, you know, sang a lot, or were there a lot of church choirs? What?
Absolutely, and
Yeah.
that was it. So there was a strong church presence. And so when I talked to some of the women and the men, you know, they grew up singing in the church, gospel music, things like that.
Yeah.
There was also a very strong folk tradition, and that carried over from the African slave trade. So there were work songs, and there were, you know, play songs like, you know, Brown Girl in the Ring and things like that. So they were, it was just part of the culture where they were singing and working at the same time and singing and
So literally
playing.
while they were working, they were
Absolutely.
singing. Well, so I'm curious about you interviewing all of these people. So you interviewed many of them in Jamaica, I assume, right?
Quite a few in Jamaica, but you know, luckily I had a pretty cheap phone plan, and I had the Radio Shack cord I could hook up to my phone,
right.
and so I actually called quite a few of them.
This theory about Stalin controlling everything was around for years, but nobody actually looked to see what Stalin actually did, right? And I understand you investigated that.
Yes, there's a very famous book called Kremlovsky Censor, or the Kremlin Censor, which argues that Stalin was intimately involved with Soviet film production. In particular, the claim there is made that Stalin read many screenplays that Soviet films were made based on. But nobody actually ever counted how many screenplays Stalin read. I have gone to the archives and tried to trace how many, and they're all listed. They're sitting there in the archive in Moscow, and they're about 10, maybe 15. And the Soviet Union at the time, this period 1930 to 1953, produced 600 films. So first of all, the percentage of films that Stalin was intimately involved in,
I'm calculating 6%.
very, very low, very, very low. And moreover, what he said about these films is extremely limited. So my favorite story from my archival research is when I went to this archive, which is hard to get to, is an archive of social political history, and I got to the Stalin, papers, and I got these screenplays, and I'm sitting over them, and the screenplay I'm looking at says, there are 3 notes by Stalin in red pencil, which he was famous for, and one says, good. Look at pages 15 and 67, and you look at pages 16 and 77, what he did is he crossed out the word Koba, which was his political pseudonym, which was too informal, and said Stalin instead. That's the amount of corrections and censorship that he did. And many screenplays, every single screenplay that I looked at had this kind of marginalia, very limited involvement.